Use the chat to ask your questions and discuss the topic. We will take time after the presentation during the Q&A to answer these. Throughout the webinar, we will stop the presentation to review. Look for the multiple choice review questions, which you will be able to answer in the polls section. Please go ahead and respond to these questions as they come up. We will have less than a minute to answer each one. This and other recorded webinars are available to WePass subscribers 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Be sure to register through wepass.com to become a subscriber. Today's topic is titled MPPG 8, LINAC Performance Tests, History and Practice, presented by Robert Kraus, physicist and radiation safety officer at St. Francis Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. Thank you for joining us, Robert.
Thank you. For those of you that attended APM in Nashville, you may have gotten seen a condensed version of this talk that I gave there. Lucky you get the expanded version today. As Christina was saying, I am a physicist at St. Francis Hospital in Memphis. I've been here it'll be 8 years in September. And I've been in the field for 15 years or so, and been a board certified medical physicist for this is the 9th year, yeah. I'm a huge fan of the MPPG project, and really liked where they took it with 8. So. My slide doesn't want to advance. Oh, there we go. Okay. So how did we get to MPPG 8? Well, in 1984, which was before I was born, APM attempted their first comprehensive QA program guidance document. And that's kind of where we got the 5% dose benchmark that we still really use today, as far as 5%, including all of your outputs and your uncertainties in your treatment planning systems, your patient motion, et cetera, et cetera. We still kind of use that 5% dose benchmark, but that's when it was first formed. And 10 years later, TG40 came out, which most of us should be familiar with TG40 because that is the comprehensive Bible that is the most current. It's still technically, much of it is still in place. It supersedes report number 13 in its entirety. It is massive as far as task reports go. It's 40 pages and attempts to cover all aspects of radiation oncology, from treatment planning to QA, brachytherapy, etc. And then 2009, we all got the dreaded TG142 or the hyped TG142, depending on what camp you fall into. And it is a pretty extensive document in its own right, but it only updates table 2 of TG40. That's the only thing it updates. Everything else is either updated by other task group reports or is still in effect. And it's, it added to the technological advances of IMRT, SRS, SBRT, etc. And now, starting in 2014, we had the MPPG program, and really the 2, 5, 8, and 9. And there's been a couple others released since I put this together. I can't remember which ones those are, but those are the ones that I remember specifically refer to the different parts of a LINAC that TG142 addressed. And then, of course, TG100, which most people know it. APM has been pushing hard since its release. So originally, in 1984, they attempted to create a document that addressed dosimetric accuracy with uncertainty and tolerances of our equipment that delivered radiation to our patients. They included sections on the different equipment, accelerators, afterloaders, seed implants, and so the external beam radiotherapy, as you can see here, the rudimentary treatment planning systems as they were in the 80s, and even radiation safety. Obviously, we're focusing on the external beam radiotherapy part, as that's what MPPG 8 addresses. So the report was, it's old enough that the PDF version on the APM website it's too grainy to really reproduce or copy and paste on a slide, so I actually just reproduced it here. As you can see, some of this stuff looks pretty familiar. If you look at the central axis dose, the annual frequency, 2% tolerance. I mean, that's pretty standard. That's been standard for a while. But then you start getting to some of this other stuff where, I mean, the dose per MU, 3% daily. I mean, that's pretty normal. But like beam uniformity being 3% or light rad field 3 millimeter. I mean, that would be way off today. And some of this stuff, the N means there's no recommendation. So there's no recommendation for how frequently you tested the ODI or the lasers, which in the 80s was relied heavily upon on patient setup. So this is kind of historical perspective of where we came from. You can look down to electron beams and you can see that the beam uniformity is 5% and that the depth dose a difference of 3 millimeters at the 80% isodose line, and that's a pretty significant difference too. But again, electron therapy hadn't been on the market for that long. So then a decade later in TG40, again, it supersedes all of 13, and they gave two reasons for updating the QA. There was advances in the field, of course, in that 10 years, 10 years is an eternity in radiation therapy. And then they just had a new kind of philosophy of what quality assurance was. And the new principles is like they offered specific guidance on the comprehensive QA program. In other words, how to actually set up a QA program, not just to test, but how to set it up and how to write the policies, etc. And they added specific section to planning for external beam radiotherapy and QA of chart. How do you do chart reviews, chart checks, film review, and they even provided an appendix on the roles or responsibilities for each team member. So here's an example of the table 2, the one about the performance tests in TG40. It may be a little grainy on your end. When we tested this, it came out grainier than on my slides. We have in the file section included the PDF of these slides if you want it, or of course you can look it up in TG40. But you can kind of, you should be pretty familiar with these tests because they haven't really changed that much, but it's a relatively short list still of the test to perform. So about 15 years later, of course, Task Group 142 was released, and it only really supersedes and adds to Table 2 of TG40. So it updated the existing beamline QA, which by beamline I mean the things in the LINAC that produce the beam or shape the beam, etc., like the MLCs that were not in TG40, dynamic virtual wedges weren't in TG40, asymmetric jaws that weren't really addressed. And then it also added the ancillary connected devices with the imaging and gating, which those are all covered in different MPPGs. But the most, in my opinion, most significant thing that it added was the concept of tolerances to a baseline. Whereas in TG40 and Report 13, the tolerances were just given 2%, 3%, but what was it relative to? And TG 142 definitively added that it is a baseline, usually from commissioning or implicitly the implementation of TG 142 if those commissioning baselines weren't known or weren't set. And here are the tables that you guys are probably familiar with from TG 142, and as you can see, they are significantly longer, which has produced some grumbling among physicists since its release. And that's actually consequently one of the things that MPPG 8 addresses, though not directly, but by its methodology. So why MPPG 8? What's wrong with 142? So one of the things I've heard is it's not accessible to the solo or community physicist or the rural physicist or, name your physicist, because it was made by academics and not really doable by the everyday physicist, if you will, with the equipment we have on hand. Made for academics is another argument I've heard. I think that's probably a little bit of a stretch. I don't really think that's true, but I can understand where they're coming from. Some people think the tolerances are too tight. There's too many unnecessary tests. too much new equipment needed in order to get these tests done. That kind of goes back to the first thing. If you're a solo physicist or in a rural setting, or community hospital like myself, it's going to be really hard to get the new equipment to implement TG142. And my favorite is I've heard other physicists complaining about it, so I don't like it either. This was a disclaimer right in TG142 saying that it is not intended to be regulations, and it's guidelines for qualified medical physicist use to interpret for your own institution. And basically that's a catch-all phrase saying don't use it for, regulators shouldn't use it for regulation, and you shouldn't use it as a Bible in your own facility. You should use your own judgment and use it as a guide. But of course, we know that when a document is presented and you're giving tables to use it, it's going to be used as a Bible, and that if you're not doing those tests, you feel like you're doing something wrong. So even though that phrase is there, you know it's not really looked at that way. It's looked at more like you need to do these tests. So in the reality, it was almost 10 years since TG142 when MPPG 8 was released. And again, it's been used as regulation, policy, and accreditation. Didn't cover BMAT. Some tests indeed were a little ambiguous on like how to perform them or what you were actually supposed to do. And I know I want a safety blanket. What is the minimum that we think is enough? Especially as a solo physicist, I want to know, am I doing enough? But at the same time, I don't want to be doing so much that it's the law of diminishing return. So if I can have some kind of safety blanket that tells me that, yes, you are doing what is required to keep your clinic and patients safe, then I have that baseline, and it kind of gives me a little bit of security. But this is straight from Eric Klein's presentation in 2015 annual meeting that TG 142 really was only meant to fill a gap between TG40 and TG 100, which is the FMEA analysis for failure modes and effects analysis that APM wants us all to do. So as you'll see, MPPG 8 fills that role quite nicely. So as a reminder, the MPPGs are an attempt by APM to provide the minimum level of medical physics support that is needed to provide prudent in clinical practice for your staffing, equipment, machines, and training. It is an attempt to create a minimally required task while they still fall just short by saying you need to do this because they don't want to kind of wedge themselves in a corner. It's basically as close as you're going to get to the minimally needed tests. And it attempts to navigate the TG nebula for the clinical physicist. When I first joined this field, there were probably a quarter of the task group reports that there are now. Now there's task group reports for everything, and it just gets crazy to try to figure out like how am I supposed to implement this into my clinic. And the MPPGs are an attempt to kind of do that. And again, these are aimed for clinical physicists. And they are not meant to supersede task group reports. They're made to work with them. But given that there are contradictions, exactly how that works is still not that clear. But we're working on it as we kind of get our footing in the MPPG project. So what is MPPG 8 not? It's not a replacement for 142, but it does offer a different methodology, and it gives an alternative perspective on what the baseline is. Again, it's not a cookbook of what tests to perform, but it does provide an explicit list of critical tests that you should, unless there's very odd circumstances, do. And this is probably one of the best things about MPPG 8. It's a practical response. These tests were generated in a practical, data-driven way and not just an expert consensus. And the report does go into a little bit more detail than the typical TG about each test, while not pigeonholing the physicist into how to do it. They still offer a lot of flexibility, but it does give a little bit of guidance. And they want to be clear. It is not a substitute for performing your own FMEA analysis, but it is kind of a safety blanket because that isn't actually what they did. They did an FMEA analysis. They had 25 different physicists do an FMEA analysis to come up with these tests. So it's basically TG100 for an average set of physicists for the LINAC performance test. So again, the list of critical performance tests gives a basic reason you do each test, basic actions upon what to do in failure, and a general description of what type of equipment for each test. The tests are mostly based off of TG100 methodology with, like as I said, 25 physicists in different facilities did their own analysis, and then they compared to some published data. And they did a little bit of rearranging to priority based on clinical experience. And again, this is a dramatic departure from the expert consensus approach that you see in TG40 and TG142. And again, my opinion is it's practical. The tests and frequency are based on the impact in the clinic. We're not just doing a test because we always did it. We're doing a test because there is a bona fide reason to do this test that has a serious impact on the clinic. Not that the test we did before didn't have a reason, but oftentimes the reason was minimally impactful to the clinic. And again, like I said, this is a generic TG100 test list, and TG100 is going to take a long time to adopt, especially in rural and community clinics. And it may not be realistic for some clinics that do not have the manpower to do it. So as a reminder, the 10,000-foot view of what failure modes and effect analysis is. It's a prospective, risk-based analysis that highlights the best procedures to maintain safety and quality. It does this by creating process trees for every step in a particular process. This little diagram over here, what's on it is not important. It's just there for kind of dramatic effect. This is the IMRT process for a clinic that was put in TG100. This is every single possible step in the IMRT process. And it is crazy. And then once you have that, you look into the possible failures at every single step. And then you rate them, the rate of occurrence, the severity of the occurrence, and that the lack of detectability for failure if we don't test specifically at that point. And so then you get a RPN score, which you just multiply all those together, and you use that to determine the necessity and frequency of a test. And that's the methodology they did to test MPPG-8. So that brings us to our first question. What is the fundamental difference between MPPG-8 and previous LINAC QA documents?
All right, everyone, this poll question is up on the side, so make sure to go ahead and weigh in. We'll just have about a minute for everyone to answer this question before we move on to the correct answer. So it's in the polls section. Go ahead and put in your answers. And if you have any questions for Robert that we can go over during the Q&A, be sure to drop those in the chat just above the polls. You'll see that option there. All right, we'll give everyone just a few more moments to answer this. But it looks like overall, overwhelmingly, there's a consensus here. All right, Robert, I think we can go ahead and go over the answer.
And it looks like about 85% of you are correct. The distractor on A that some answered, that is TG142 that established the commissioning baseline as the parameter test. MPPGA uses FMEA analysis to determine appropriate testing and frequency. All right, so this is a little chart that I created, and this shows, it's kind of busy. And like I said, the PDFs is attached in files. Feel free to download it so you can look at this later. But we're going to spend some time here so we can kind of break this down. This is a comparison of TG142 test and MPPG-8. If you look, if anything that is green is a change, an added test, or or the dark green, the bold green is added test. The light green is the tolerance was created more stringent or more frequent. bold red means it was deleted from TG142. The lighter red is the relaxed tolerance or frequency. The italics is something that was kind of clarified from TG142, and it's minor. And the anything that's crossed out was eliminated but replaced by a different test above it. So looking down through this, the main thing that we see is that electron output constancy is not daily, which most of us are doing daily anyway. The photon profile constancy, it's MPPGA is saying to do it daily because they decided that when you look at how important that is, and if you lose your beam shape, that can be pretty catastrophic. So they decided that daily was the more appropriate way to test that. And most of us have some kind of array like a daily QA3 or something that can test that anyway. So that's not too bad. The photon profile constancy, as you can see, they've loosened that monthly. They felt that it was a little bit too strict. And you can see some other things down here, like electron profile constancy. The big things that we need to look at here is that flatness and symmetry in MPPG8 is no longer applicable. Now that may seem odd, given I just said that your profile constancy is important. But let's think about this for a second. Flatness and symmetry was originally an idea from back like in the 80s, where you were relying on hand calculations or maybe transparency isodose lines. And the importance was that your beam was flat and it was symmetric to what you knew, so that your calculations were as close as they can be. But now we've got weird shaped beams. We have flattening filter free beams. Even though MPPGA doesn't directly apply to CyberKnife, if you think about a CyberKnife beam, it doesn't have a flattening filter either. So flatness is not really that great of a test anymore. Symmetry, likewise, technically, even if your beam was commissioned asymmetrically, as long as that beam stayed the same all the time and it was in your treatment planning system that way, it really doesn't matter. So they replaced it with this photon profile constancy, an electron beam profile constancy. In other words, as long as your beam, your off-axis doses, or your profile shape looks like what's in your treatment planning system or your baseline, then you're good. So those tests have just been replaced with this beam profile constancy, which is now a catch-all for it. Includes flattening filter free beams and other odd beam arrangements, and is more appropriate for today's day and age. Now, some of these other ones down here, like if you look down, field size output factors, right? So your output factor for a 4x4 or a 6x6 are all relative to your 10x10. It's not there anymore. They got rid of it completely. Now that is kind of shocking to me, because that is something that I've always measured, and actually I still do spot check them because it just seems so crazy to me. But if you think about it logically, it makes sense. If your output's the same, if your profile shape's the same, and your jaw size is all the same, there's nothing that would make your field size output factors change. So if all those other things that we're testing are the same and within tolerance, then those output factors are not going to change. So why would you test it? It's redundant. It's the same thing for electron cone factors. If all your dosimetric parameters on your electron beams are correct, what, except someone physically changing your cone inserts, what is going to change? It's not. So again, it's another test that they removed. Physical wedge factors, not even really even included anymore, because most folks aren't even using them. They've changed photon constancy for dose light. They got rid of the monthly one and just add annual, because most LINACs are pretty stable. And then there are a couple other things that they've changed. the tolerance. They increased the tolerance on the constancy versus gantry angle because they thought it was a little bit too stringent. In that, if you were within 2%, it's not going to be clinically significant. Again, this is general. There's an MPPG there's an MPPG for SRS and SBRT. So remember, this is in the context of a general external beam radiotherapy machine. Okay, and then it added these dynamic delivery and lead position accuracy down here at the bottom, which if anybody uses like SNC machine or routine, those tests are in there. And Varian actually for if you have a Varian machine, you're actually provided with the plans to make those happen. And again, this is the mechanical tests. There is no more, or they've lessened the light for rad field to just after service because we don't use the light field that much anymore. But given that and given the other tests, they did say that we needed to add a monthly test for jaw position. Safety tests, the radiation area monitor, they basically just made it so it's an annual test that it's functional and took the daily check out. And then they, added a couple things like that your wedge factor for all angles now, it's 2% of TPS. So that gives you an idea of how it kind of tidied up the TG142, where it kind of relaxed a few tolerances that were too tight and it deleted some redundant tests. So that brings us to question number 2. Which of the following is a test from TG142 that is not included in MPPG 8?
Okay, great. This question is up in our polls section, so please go ahead and make sure to answer this one live so we can go ahead and review. And also just a reminder, if anyone has any Q&A questions for the end, be sure to stick around, put them in the chat, and we'll make sure to go over that at the end of the presentation here in about half an hour. All right, looks like a lot of folks are weighing in here, which is great. Thank you so much for putting in your answers. And again, it looks like we have a majority here, Robert. I think we can go ahead and go over the answer.
It is indeed flatness and symmetry. As we discussed, it was changed to a profile constancy to make it more relevant to today's radiation beams. And that's kind of the why, because again, we have various different shape beams and we don't care so much about flatness and symmetry as we do that our beams and our treatment planning system profiles are matching. Okay, so let's say you're like me and you decide MPPG 8 is great. It looks a lot more practical. It looks like the methodology was a little bit more data driven. So let's implement it. So what do we got to do? So first, you got to decide what tests are you going to do. What are the critical tests for your clinic? Well, given that MPPG 8, the goal was to make a set of critical tests. It's highly recommended that you include all of MPPG 8. Of course, there are going to be things that maybe don't apply to your clinic or that you just can't do. And those are going to be the outliers where you may not be able to do that test. But if at all possible, all of MPPG 8 is recommended. And then for your clinic, you got to decide, you need to increase the frequency of these tests. Is there a reason that you think that in your clinic, a test needs to be done more frequently? And then let's look at the TG142 tests that were dropped. Are there any of those tests that you think that your clinic probably should continue? And then, of course, these lists are not exhaustive of possible tests that you can do to your LINAC. So are there other tests that you need to add? So as an example, in my clinic, we're testing dose rate constancy monthly. There is a little story behind that on why I'm testing it monthly. We had an old 6EX machine. When I first got here, I had never had a magnetron Varian LINAC before. And I needed to, the beam was a little bit asymmetric. I wanted to steer it. So I called the engineer in the engineer came in, and I had never As I said, I'd never steered one before. And he came in and he started messing with a pot, and I'm just trusting the engineer to know what he's doing. And it's not really changing much. And it finally changed a little bit. And come to find out, a little bit later, someone tells me, you can't steer a varying magnetron machine from the card case. You have to do it with manual shims in the head of the machine. I was like, well, what the heck was he turning? Well, fast forward to about 6 months, maybe a year later, and I did dose rate check. I didn't check it monthly. I checked it annually at the time because we only used one dose rate on that machine. And to come to find out, at the lower dose rates, the dose was about 10% high. And I don't remember what the specific pot was. This was years ago, but whatever the specific pot was, it does change your dose linearity on your pulses. So given that I was thoroughly freaked out by that, we still test our dose rate constancy monthly, just for my own personal sanity. And given that we have a software that does it, it takes an extra, 30 seconds to test another dose rate. So it's not a big deal. And as I said before, I still spot check my field size dependent output factors. The reason why I do that is because I, habit, and I'm a solo physicist. So it's a double check. If something's off on my output factor, then I know that one of my other tests maybe didn't give me as much information as I needed, or that I screwed up somewhere. So it's just some redundancy for my own, again, personal sanity. And I do check the cone factors, I guess for the same reason, although I think I'm going to phase that out because there's a lot less that can go wrong with a cone factor than there can with a field size. And then I test the DLG and leaf leakage semi-annually, and there's a little asterisk there because DLG is not included anywhere specifically in MPPG 8, but we'll talk about that in a little bit later. And again, we measure a single wedge dose daily, although which is a little bit more frequently than MPPG 8 suggests. They suggest daily, although it does recommend that you do an output. And I test all profiles and outputs annually, not just for the 60, because I figure that it's a computer program. There could be something that could go wrong with the speed of the jaw or whatever that's forming that leaf. And again, it doesn't really take that much time in the scheme of an annual. And then again, going to DLG, this is, I talked to the author, Corn Smith, who was kind enough to, or the lead author, the corresponding author, to kind of, when I first gave this talk in 2018, to kind of explain a couple things. And the DLG and interleaf leakage is all kind of thrown into this comprehensive review of machine settings. And I really wish, this is one of the things that I kind of don't like about MPPG 8. I wish that they would have included this in there, especially since its release, and even at the time, but even especially since its release, we're getting more and more and more practical clinical data that shows how important those things are to measure that. For those of you who don't know, the DLG is the basic, the fudge factor that you put in a clips for a varying machine or any machine really that has rounded leaf edges. Since Eclipse models MLCs with a square edge, you basically fudge the system into modeling that square gap between the leaves. To kind of represent the amount that actually passes through that rounded edge of the actual leaf. And that, especially on highly modulated plants, has a big effect. They felt like they don't really change, but from practical experience, and this is all anecdote, but after service or if there's a lot of grease in there, it can change. In the machine. And so I felt like it should be more explicitly stated in MPPG 8. And so anyway, we measure it at least annually, if not semi-annually. The same thing with interleaf leakage. And as you see, here's a note on table 6 that it includes the leaf offset and electa and the transmission. And that also includes all the collimator settings for electron cones and default dose rates and all of that stuff. That brings us to question 3. Where is DLG included in MPPG 8?
All right, great. So this question is up in our polls section. Be sure to go ahead and weigh in live. It's only going to be up for about a minute. So we want to make sure everyone gets a chance to answer this question. And if you have any questions about the presentation so far that have come up, be sure to put those in the chat so that we can go over them at the end here during the Q&A. Wow, it looks like some folks are having a little bit of a harder time. It seems like this question was a little more challenging here. You want to go ahead and review this one here, Robert?
Yeah, so technically A is correct, but I don't fault anyone for saying B. It's not, it actually isn't definitively in the document anywhere, but it was intended to be included in the review of machine settings. And that was, again, I had to get clarification from the corresponding author for that. And that is what she said, that it was intended to be in that review of machine settings. So A is more right than B, but B is not wrong, if that makes sense. All right, so step 2, you got to decide what equipment you have, what you have to perform the test, and what you would need to perform it. MPPG 8 is designed to be performed with the normal equipment a physicist should have. If you're doing the test that you should be doing, you have the equipment that you need to do. It's flexible. There's many different ways that you can perform the test that they have in the document. And furthermore, it actually is probably it probably gives the most guidance of any document that came out of APM that I've seen on how to do certain tests. That was a frustration of mine in TG 142, is that it says to do this test and you're like, okay, how? And so MPPG 8 gives you some guidance and some suggestions, and kind of, it doesn't say specifically how to do it because it wants to maintain flexibility, but it does give a little bit of guidance, which is nice. So here's a little table on equipment. So photon electron output constancy. The blue is the minimum equipment you would need, and this is my opinion, and the red is a recommended equipment. So photon electron output constancy. Annually, you need your water tank, or you need a water tank, a little water tank to do it, and calibrate ion chamber. And then to do your monthlies, you probably would want some solid water. Technically, you could do it in a water tank, but no one wants to lug a water tank out, and most people have solid water, so I put that in the minimum equipment. For your electrons, it's the same. Your beam energy, annually or even monthly, your minimum is that ion chamber and water tank again. Although you can see that a daily QA device measures your beam energy, your solid water can do it as well. I'm sorry, that's for profile constancy. If you have a daily QA device, it's measuring a spot check of your symmetry flatness, which is, again, we don't really have symmetry and flatness again, but it's a single point, so it would be constancy in those 2 points. The electron beam energy, same thing. Photon beam energy, let's see, photon, yeah, so that's ion chamber, water, daily QA device. And your dynamic delivery control, that's the same as your kind of your leaf speed and your gantry angle test. And there's multiple different ways. They're very flexible on how to do that. Most of the time, if you have an EPID, you don't even need anything else other than your EPID. You have your photon MU linearity that's tested annually, electron MU linearity, again, water tank, ion chamber, or solid water, that's all you need. And really your ion chamber and water tank and solid water are the main things that you need. Although photon output for dose rate, some kind of gantry mounted device would be great. And your off-axis factors and your gantry angle, the gantry mounted array, like a map check or a matrix or something like that. It'd be fantastic. So over here in this, you see minimum equipment, those 3 things that every physicist should have. But the things that I would recommend is make it a 3D water tank. It's a lot easier to do profiles. Morning, a daily QA array of some sort, an EPID, some sort of diode ion chamber array like a matrix or map check, and a gantry mount to put those things on. For your mechanical tests, you got the mechanical front pointer for that comes with the machines to test your lasers and ODI, which aren't even really used that much anymore. But draw position, you can use a ruler or graph paper, and you can find a ruler anywhere. And any kind of film, gaphachromic film would be the best for like light brad coincidence after service. And my favorite is the physical graticule. It's a very complicated piece of equipment called your eyes, because that's the easiest way to do it. And you look at it and see, well, does the physical graticule, if you use it, does it line up to the crosshair? Oh, good, great. And as you can see, there is some recommended equipment to the right. The Jig Daily QA Array makes it really easy to measure your lasers, because it usually has an etching on the side, or if you have a little puck, this one makes it really easy. And your leaf position accuracy using an EPID and software is now almost ubiquitous. And the radiation isocentricity, they say you can still use the old-fashioned star shots, but that a Winston-Lutz test is preferred, because a Winston-Lutz test does it all in concert, and you're not measuring the 3 planes separately. But again, if you don't have a Winston-Lutz phantom or software to do the analysis, or your programming chops aren't up to creating one yourself, then the old star shots are still just fine. And wedge tests, again, arrays are the way to go with this. But again, you can do it with this basic equipment that everyone should have. So if you look at the full list, you have over here your normal physics equipment that everyone should have in your closet. Heck, if you have a closet that hasn't been touched in 2 decades, all this stuff should be in there. But with the modern technology, you can do better tests much quicker if you have this list over here. And I would emphasize software. There's a bunch of software in the market that will do all the analysis for you very quickly, and it cuts down on the time a lot. All right, question 4. MPPG 8 requires specialized equipment. True, false?
All right, everyone. So you can go ahead and press the polls tab in your webinar window here to weigh in on this question. It'll just be up for a little bit. And if you have any questions, I'm so grateful that some of you have already asked some questions for the QA, but please go ahead and put those in there now for the Q&A, which will be coming up here shortly. And yeah, it looks like we've got a good split here on this one, a little trickier.
It is false. It doesn't require specialized equipment, though specialized equipment can make your life easier. That's the key to take away. All right, so step 3. After assessing your equipment, you're evaluating what tests you should perform, not what you need to perform, but what you should perform that is practical with the set equipment or any other equipment you have available. So if you have the equipment and you can do the test efficiently, then the question is, well, if it adds anything to it and you can do it efficiently, it doesn't take much extra time, then you probably should do it. Basically, you do a cost benefit analysis. If it's an extra test or an extra frequency of a test and it's not much effort, you might as well do it. And some of the ones that we do here, electron energy, daily light rad on the daily QA array, because it's easy, it's right there. Therapists have always done it, so what they don't know doesn't hurt them, so they can just keep doing it. And with an ion chamber, or we have a diode array, we have a map check here, we do multiple wedge profiles, and we can spot check open profiles as well. And we have SNC machine here, or SNC routine as it's called now. And so a lot of this stuff we do with trajectory files and EPID and everything. And these tests are required. But all this together is done with the EPID. And then we do a few extra MLC checks with our EPID and the portal dosimetry and whatnot. So, and this is all stuff that's really easy to do. So it's kind of like, why not do it? Question 5. MPPG 8 includes all of the tests, all of the LINAC tests every facility should perform. True or false?
All right, this is our last poll question here, so make sure to go ahead and weigh in for this live question. And again, if you have any questions for Robert for the Q&A, be sure to drop those in the chat. We'll be reviewing those at the end of the presentation here. Okay, we'll give everyone just another moment to answer this question, then we can review the answer. Looks like we're getting a little more consensus on this question.
The answer is false. It includes, again, a clinical minimum of tests that facilities should perform, and every clinic should evaluate what other tests that they feel like is required. Excuse me. So step 4 is at some point you have to reassess all these tests you came up with and the tolerances. At some interval. And I left it blank because that's going to be up to your facility. It's not really recommended because it's going to be very flexible and I don't know what it should be, and that's going to be up to your clinic. But they do need to be reassessed. I mean, it should something that you really do continuously anyway. Obstacles to implementation is the equipment, the typical equipment, that minimum equipment. It's not efficient to use it. So it's the old question of, I have the minimum equipment needed, but having a little bit more would be nice. And it's, how do you convince an administrator that you need something when the stuff you have is, you can do it, but it's not that efficient. That's sometimes can be a difficult sell. And you have to rethink traditional QA. Why have we always done whatever? Or, oh my gosh, MPPG 8 doesn't even include flat scintimetry or output factors. So you got to kind of think that the methodology is different in how the tests were come up with. And then you have to decide what is the minimum for your clinic. What is good enough? Do you need to add something? Do you not have, if you don't have the full resources to do FMEA analysis, then, which is redundant, FMEA analysis. But anyway, you don't have all the resources to do that full TG100. So how are you going to figure out what is good enough? You have this baseline of MPPG 8 when they did the FMEA, kind of in general, but is that good enough for your clinic? So that's kind of, and I don't have an answer for that. That's going to be something that you have to decide, but that could be an obstacle because we don't know what is good enough. We know what the minimum is, but minimum is not always right. All right, so the implementation time, it doesn't take that long to figure out and this is for one LINAC, a basic LINAC, not a SRS LINAC. One LINAC. This is kind of how long it took me to assess the test on the document, what we need to do, the equipment that we had to do it, what extra tests. It took me a while to kind of walk through different tests and figure out what was really feasible. The critical test implementation is quick because most of those tests you should already be doing. And then the additional tests, again, that takes some time because you got to figure out what is doable, what is needed. And then again, the reassessment, like I said before, should be an ongoing procedure. So is it worth it to me? Yes, absolutely. In your own clinic, I would absolutely implement MPPG 8. Why? Again, fundamentally changes the way you think about QA. It's more practical and data-driven. That forces us to ask why we're performing a test. It's the closest thing to a minimum required list that the APM is probably going to give us. It eliminates a lot of over QAing or over tolerancing, if you will. QA is a lot quicker, and I don't feel like I'm losing anything. The document itself clarifies and streamlines some previous tests, and guidance. There's more guidance to the actual test in the document itself. And as I said here, personally, it clarified a few tests I've done for years, but it actually made them make a little bit more sense to me. And then my own personal opinion, his approach just makes sense to me. And that concludes my talk.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that presentation, Robert. And we have a few questions here in the chat, so I'm just going to scroll down to the first one, which is highlighted here. In MPPG, why is beam profile consistency included as daily QA?
I would have to go back and read that particular part of the document, because that's one thing that's nice about the document is it kind of goes through the methodology of why each test is included. But I believe it has to do with the fact that there have been, although very rare, have been cases where a catastrophic change in a beam shape was not caught by the interlocks and caused some serious issues on some patients during the day. And that would be my guess. When you do that FMEA analysis, there's the one letter, which escapes me right now, which letter that is, that explains about how destructive that particular failure could be. That would be a very, very high one. Its odds of occurring is probably low, but what can happen if you have a catastrophic profile failure? It would be pretty bad. But again, the document itself, I'd have to go back and read the specific portion of the document that talks about that and see what their rationale was.
Okay, thank you for answering that. Our next question, what do you think about photon versus electron linearity? Latest variant Trubing acceptance documents only recommends to test one energy for linearity since they share the same dosimetry hardware, e.g. monitor chamber cables, BGM controller.
Ooh, that's a tough one. Well, the first thing is that that's kind of a black box and kind of very in telling you that all of this stuff is the same, right? And how long does it take you to test a quick linearity, even a 2-point linearity, test 10 monitor units and 100 monitor units? It doesn't take that long. So given that, given the importance of something like linearity, and my personal experience with having issues with linearity, I would probably just go ahead and test it, though I would certainly be able to be convinced otherwise if I sat down with a variant engineer and they kind of showed me exactly why that was the case. Because just reading a document, I'm like, but if I hear an engineer kind of talk to me about it, then maybe I could be convinced, I guess. But then the other thing is that most people that are running electrons, they kind of run the monitor units in the same general ballpark. The monitor units aren't changing just a ton. So if you add that to the mix, and then maybe it makes sense to only test one. I don't know.
All right, thanks for answering that one. Our next one here, just curious what others do with their DLG and ARIA. What device do you measure with? Do you optimize the value based on treatment plan measurements?
Okay, so DLG, it's kind of controversial, kind of like there's a lot of different ways to do it. What is right, I don't know. Personally, I measure it with an ion chamber. I use Varian has a document that explains and describes how to measure it. And I do that. I did it with my 10x beam and my 6x beam, and my portal dosimetry results are a lot better than they were. But other people, they just tweak them in the system. They don't actually measure them. They tweak it in the system, and until they get the best result. And given that it is kind of a fudge factor in and of itself, I don't think either way is necessarily wrong. One thing that I will point out is that the DLG can be different for different types of treatments. And so I know several facilities that have different, now in the newer versions of Eclipse, you can change the DLG by calculation model. And so they actually have different DLGs for different types of treatments, and they use different beam models, kind of similar like how they might use a different spot size for like SRS and larger fields. But again, I don't think there's a wrong way to do it, because mainly, again, the idea is that we want to just match our delivery to what our treatment planning system does. If trial and error by changing it is the way to do it, fine. If you measure it and you start getting good results, that's fine too.
Thanks for answering that question. Our next one here. How do you feel that things like Varian's MPC, which is fantastic, plays into MPPG 8 or future paradigms?
Yeah, so that's a question that's very, very common. And it's a hard one to answer, because MPC is kind of a black box. We kind of know what it's testing, but we don't necessarily know how it's testing it. And then you also have the problem of Varian stating that it is not made to replace any kind of quality assurance. It is simply a performance check for itself, and basically is a flag that something is wrong. Now, I've sat in several presentations at AAPM over the last couple of years, and they have really looked at MPC, and they think it is fantastic and that it actually measures a lot of the same stuff. But honestly, I think that you get yourself into a legal pickle until Varian decides to hand it over to physicists to say, hey, is this good enough? And can we take this warning label off of it? Because if the manufacturer says it's not supposed to be used for QA, don't use it for QA, because if something ever happens, you're gonna get your pantsuit off because you used something that the manufacturer said you're not supposed to use in that manner. But my personal feeling is that it's great. It's fantastic. It tests a lot of things. There's a couple things some couple drawbacks. One is that, like the MLCs, it doesn't test all the MLCs. It only tests the inner MLCs, and just little things like that. So.
Thanks for answering that question. Our last question here. How about MLC QA, such as DLG measurement in LTEC Precise LINAC?
I have no experience with Electa, so I can't really answer that question. I actually, the funny thing is that I saw on Twitter, actually, right after the virtual AAPM meeting, someone asked that very question about the DLG. And I actually know someone, I have a friend, he may be on this talk actually, that works at Electa, that I asked, and he's like, well, we don't really, the DLG is is an Eclipse thing. So we don't really have procedures for that, but there are people out there that do it. So I'm actually attempting to find someone that can share that information, since there are people out there that want a little bit of help with that. And if I do, I will, I'll post it on Twitter, which I am RFKMICHMAN on Twitter, for those that care.
Great. Thank you so much for answering those questions and for presenting this webinar, Robert. And thank you all for joining us for this free event hosted by WePassed. I just want to remind everyone that this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel for the next week or so. If you'd like to review this presentation, be sure to check it out there. And also be sure to join us for our next webinar, AAPM TG292, Electronic Brachytherapy Dosimetry, presented by Dr. Wesley Culbertson on Wednesday, August 26th at noon Eastern. And just keep in mind that this and many other recorded webinars are always available to WePass subscribers 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So be sure to register through wepass.com to become a subscriber. And for up-to-date information about upcoming webinars, you can follow us, WePass, on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And if you have a moment, please help us improve future webinars by taking this short survey. Thanks again.
Thank you.
All right, have a good day. Bye.